Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of Illinois American Water, we thank you for taking the time today to join us, and we are very grateful for our partners at the University of Illinois Extension on partnering with us on this Clean Water webinar series. We hope that you enjoy today's webinar and stay safe with the weather that we're experiencing across the state. And with that, I will hand it over to Eliana.
Thanks, Anna. We're grateful for this partnership with Illinois American Water. My name is Ileana Brown, Extension Water Quality and Stormwater Specialist. I will be moderating for our speaker today. Abigail Garofalo and Lane Kanoki are also here to help take care of the webinar. This presentation is being recorded and will be shared to University of Illinois Extension's YouTube page at go.illinois.edu/cleanwaterconservation. The link is in the chat box. Please allow time for processing and closed captioning. We'll follow up with an email when the video posts. Closed captioning is enabled today. You can control whether you see the captioning in the Zoom control bar on your screen. If you have content questions, we ask that you wait at the end and the speaker's email will be provided. We have a 1-minute feedback survey that we ask you take at the end of today's presentation. This helps us make continuous improvements that better serve you. We'll put the link in the chat box now, so you'll have it when the webinar is done. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Brody Dunn is a Pollinator and Biodiversity Outreach Associate for Illinois Extension's Natural Resources, Environment, and Energy team. His primary work is on pollinator programming coordination, but he also consults scientific literature and university faculty to answer questions on the topic of native pollinators, the Endangered Species Act, urban ecology, and other issues. As an extension professional, graduate student, or laboratory tech, Brody has worked in the entomological field for nearly a decade. He has an active personal interest in both botany and urban sustainability. Brody has a master's in crop science and a bachelor's in environmental sustainability, both from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And now I'll hand it over to Brody.
All right, Eliana, can you hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction. And I will get started. Okay, hello, and thank you again for joining us. Today I'm going to be telling you about pollinator gardens. To conserve water, we look for areas in our home where we can do more with less. Pollinator garden is something beneficial that you can do in your yard that does not require a lot of water, at least after it's established. And what's more, can really help out beneficial insects. It can also soak up rainwater a lot better than turf grass can. This can help with local flooding. This is the 4th webinar in a series of 4 water conservation webinars. We are honored to partner with Illinois American Water and you in working towards good stewardship of our water resources. In the next 30 minutes, we're going to explore some concepts for creating a pollinator garden. One of the things we will go over in this presentation is that water conserving native plants are helpful for pollinators. So I'm going to start us off with a question about native plants. Hopefully. For those of you viewing the recording, no pop-up is going to be on your screen, but for those attending live, you should see one now. Looks like folks are answering already. Excellent. Looks like a lot of folks are saying equal. Very interesting. I think we can go ahead and stop our poll here. Alrighty. All right, folks, if you guessed B, oops. If you guessed B, you're correct. But if you got it wrong, don't worry. We'll talk more about this in the next half hour. All right. What plants are best for pollinators? This is the question I get quite often. You know, what plant can I put in my garden that is going to make it pollinator friendly? But there are some considerations here. Pollinator is not a species of animal. It's a job description. And it's something that a lot of different animals do. Because of this, there's a lot of different kinds of pollinators. Bees are pollinators. Butterflies are pollinators. But so are moths, some birds, wasps, and even some flies. Each of these animals has a really unique needs, right? There's many kinds of pollinators. Number two, no one plant is a panacea. No one plant is going to provide everything that everybody needs. Number three, there are a lot of plants out there, many of which provide a little slice of what pollinators need, but only some of which are going to be suitable for the kinds of gardening we want to do. So there's good news and bad news. While it's very difficult to give you something like a definitive list of like the top 10 most pollinator friendly plants, I can give you a few principles that, if followed, will allow you to assemble a garden that serves your needs, pollinators' needs, and helps with water conservation. Okay, so what are our principles? Number one, I copied this one from May Berenbaum. She's the head of the entomology department at UIUC, but I don't feel bad about copying it because she copied it herself. She took it from the medical trade. The principle is do no harm. She calls it the venerable goal. I really like that. Now I use it in all my presentations. And number two, right plant, right place. This is a phrase from our horticulture educators, and I'll explain a little bit more in a bit. Number three, big and small, late and early. This is about flower form and blooming period, which are both very important. Number four, native plants are best, and it's for a reason that you may not expect. Okay, our first principle, do no harm. So what we can do is we can look at some typical garden practices and try to identify some things which can hurt pollinators. One of those is how we manage our yards in the fall. So my first point here is leave the leaves. Every fall, we like to make our yards look nice and neat. We mow the flower stems down. We rake up all the leaves. We put them all in bags, and then we put it out at the curb. Stop doing that, or at least some of it if you can. Other than returning nutrients to the soil as they decompose, leaves provide an insulation layer on the ground that invertebrates, including some pollinators, use throughout the winter. That said, some of you I know are going to have to rake those leaves, at least some of them. I know this because we have to do it over here at the Red Oak Rain Garden. You know, if you have a tree with an enormous canopy, or God forbid, you've got something with enormous leaves like a sycamore, you're probably going to have to do a little bit of leaf management. At the Red Oak Rain Garden, they tried to do no leaf management and it didn't work. This is because all those leaves from that huge canopy got funneled down into a relatively small space, right? Because there's sidewalks that are going through this, a little parking lot over there. So these leaves that would normally spread out over a pretty wide area got all concentrated down into this little tiny space, and it created an almost impenetrable layer of thatch that the plants couldn't break through in the spring. So what Lane and Eliana have to do is they go out with their volunteers and they take half the leaves, right? And you might have to do that too, right? So they don't take all of them, they still leave some, but they have to take some so that the plants can get out in the spring, can break through that thatch layer. You have to accommodate your circumstances sometimes. And if the only way that you can keep these leaves is for them to like go spilling out into the road, don't do that either. When these leaves break down, they're releasing nutrients. But those nutrients, when they're out on the street, they're not going to the ground, they're going into the water. And so instead of it being a good thing, it becomes a pollutant. And it's a huge source of phosphorus. And all those nutrients end up out in the Gulf of Mexico, right? So don't do that. Just leave what you can and handle what you and control what you can, right? My second point here is remove and replace invasives with and replace in italics. Some folks argue that invasive plants are actually good for pollinators because a lot of them do flower and therefore offer some nectar and pollen. The problem is that invasive plants will take over whole ecosystems. When they do that, they prevent other things from blooming. So it's true that you do get one big bloom. That's totally true. But it's at the expense of these other things that would bloom over a much longer period of time. But if you cut down all those invasives and just replace them with lawn, the pollinators don't even get that one big pulse of resources. So you should absolutely remove invasives in your yard. and definitely don't plant any new ones. Um, and in some cases that this is an ecological imperative, right? But in some cases it's actually a legal one. Municipal codes in a lot of cities actually require that your yard be free of invasive plants. But when you remove those invasives, make sure something's taking their place, something useful. My third point here is a responsible use of pesticide. Make sure you're only using pesticide when you really need it. And when you do use it, that you're using it right. Make sure you're reading the label. You're using it in an integrated pest management framework, IPM. And to get rid of some of these invasives, you really actually will have to use almost certainly some herbicide. Just when you use it, make sure you're using it safely, right? And if you have any questions about leaf management in the fall, about invasive plants, or about pesticides, please feel free to reach out to your local extension office. We have experts that work on these things, and we can get you the information you need. Okay, right plant, right place. This is that principle that I got from our horticulture educators. And this is something you have to do regardless of what kind of gardening you're doing. You have to consider the conditions as they relate to the biological needs and capacities of the plant. You have to consider the soil requirements, water needs, the amount of sun and shade. And if you're putting like a rain garden into some place that next to some place that gets salted, you might also have to consider salinity tolerance. I would also argue that another part of this that is important are non-biological factors. At Extension, we're trying to recommend planting more native plants. But the thing about some of these native plants is that they can get pretty tall. Now, if you look at my picture here, this is a sawtooth sunflower. It's probably 15 feet tall. Not every native plant gets this tall. In fact, not even all sawtooth sunflowers get this tall. But the point is that some of these native plants are just taller than what we're used to seeing. Not all of them. Isn't hard to find ones that are shorter or even short. But if you aren't paying attention, you'll accidentally plant something huge and then have to deal with your neighbors and stuff. In the case of this sawtooth sunflower here, this is kind of a perfect example of someone who absolutely nailed the biological requirements perfectly, right? This plant, the happiest plant ever, right? But they didn't think about how tall a first-year sawtooth sunflower can get, or more likely they didn't know, right? So this is a bus stop, and you can kind of see that they put a stake in the ground to try to support this thing. Well, eventually, of course, the stake gave out, and they ended up having to tie this to that light post. I'm not kidding. But in the intervening time, there was a storm, and this thing fell over, and it flopped over onto the sidewalk. And of course, like for most people, this isn't a big deal. You can just go around. Though if you live in a city, a lot of cities just won't tolerate that. They'll give you a ticket for having stuff in the sidewalk or blocking it. But like, more than that, you don't want to be the person who's got a row of like 8-foot tall plants that have flopped over onto the sidewalk after a storm that's keeping somebody with a cane or a wheelchair from getting where they need to go. So, don't be that person. But if you want something like a sawtooth sunflower, or something like Joe Pye weed or common milkweed or anything else that gets a little tall, you probably want it in your backyard. But wherever you put it, make sure that you've talked to your neighbors, and definitely make sure you're not breaking any of your city's municipal codes. I've worked with cities on their landscaping codes before. A lot of them have regulations that were put together in the 50s, and these were really sometimes the 80s. These were really designed to just make sure folks were mowing the grass. In fact, one code I worked on tied the definition of what constitutes a weed just to height. And so anything taller than 6 inches, regardless of what it was, a flower, grass, anything, or genuine weed, it didn't matter. If it was taller than 6 inches to the city, it was a weed. And like what this means is that if you've got one neighbor that's just really not on board with, one of your gardening practices, they can complain to the city, and the city will have to give you a ticket. So most cities aren't like this, but some are, and it's something that you should think about when you're designing things. Review the municipal code that your city has, right? Look out for height limitations, where height is limited. Usually on either side of the driveway, there's going to be a sight triangle where you can't have tall plants so people can see when they're pulling in and out of the drive. There's going to be a buffer next to the sidewalk to keep plants from from flopping over. There's probably also a height difference between your front yard and your backyard. But read your code, figure these things out. If you need help navigating that, again, you can contact your local extension office. Okay, our next principle, big and small, late and early. And here we're going to tackle the first part of this little phrase, big and small. This is kind of a shorthand for diversity of form. Diverse form is important because different shapes and colors of flowers appeal to different pollinators. We call this set of characteristics a pollination syndrome. We have a chart here displaying this on the Illinois Pollinators website. I will link that at the end of the presentation. It shows what kinds of flower characteristics appeal to the various categories of pollinators. So let's look at butterflies specifically. Butterflies have this long coiled proboscis. You can see this in picture A, top left. They use this to drink nectar. So flowers that evolved with butterfly pollination will typically have a long, narrow spur, which only butterflies can really access. This means that on average, butterflies are the ones that are visiting those flowers. And the pollen that those flowers make is more likely to have a direct route to another flower of the same species. And this reinforces the system because they have this more direct relationship, right? But the corollary to that is that because these flowers are better suited for one kind of pollinator, they're maybe a little bit less suited for other kinds of pollinators. So some bees might have trouble getting into the narrow spur of a butterfly adapted flower. And vice versa, a butterfly could have a hard time landing on something like this really itty bitty tiny flower of this blue-eyed grass. So what I mean when I say big and small is don't just have one kind of flower. If you have a diversity of form and color, everybody gets to eat. All right, so let's move on to the second part of this little phrase, late and early. This chart is taken from one of the Red Oak Rain Garden pamphlets. It's a planting list for a rain garden. I highly recommend these. Again, I'll have a link at the end of the presentation. But the great thing about these is that they have these charts that are arranged by bloom time, and I will highlight the bloom time here. And actually, if we simplify this down a little bit, we can use it to illustrate my point, right? So this chart is arranged from spring to fall. It starts roughly at final frost and goes to first frost. So it's frost to frost. This is the growing season, right? What you can see is that there is at least one plant blooming across almost the entire growing season, at least one. Far too often what happens is that folks will put together a garden that instead of having this nice long progression of floral availability, it'll look more like this, where there's lots of flowers, but they really only bloom from late spring to early fall. And the problem with that is this, these two periods, early spring and late fall, are when pollinators have the fewest resources available to them. These are when the pollinators are actually struggling. So if you want to have a pollinator-friendly garden, it's important that you have this longer spread, that you're providing resources throughout the entire year and not just in that narrow range, basically in the summer. One hiccup here is that early spring can be really tough. Evolutionarily speaking, it's really risky to bloom when a frost might come through. So not very many plants do it. You don't want to lose that like big investment that they've put in their flowers, right? Like they don't want to lose those flowers. So you're kind of limited to spring ephemerals and some shrubs, things like witch hazel. And these can be hard to incorporate into a pollinator garden, whether it's a rain garden or otherwise. So it's okay if you have to have a little bit of a gap at the front. But late fall is super easy. Asters and goldenrods. There are some really beautiful asters and beautiful goldenrods, and there's a surprising diversity of both. They're great. All right, our last principle, native is best. Why is that? Native plants are better adapted to our climate. Many don't require watering after establishment. This is where you're getting that water conservation from, right? Many can also withstand big rainfalls, and you can put them in rain gardens, and that can help with local flooding. Native plants are also not going to be invasive, definitionally. They've been in this ecosystem for longer than we have. Lots of plants in the horticultural trade, these are not natives, have actually ended up being invasive, and we're still seeing this happen. So things like Japanese barberry, which I used to work in a garden center. I sold a ton of those. It was a long time ago. Please forgive me. But these are increasingly recognized as being invasive. These Japanese barberries are. And so there's always a worry that some of these seemingly innocuous non-native plants are going to end up being invasive eventually. But with native plants, we just don't have to worry about that. Even though some can be aggressive, we just know they're not going to be invasive. But a really big reason why native plants are best is actually because of metamorphosis. To review, metamorphosis is this thing that a lot of insects and most pollinators do as part of their life cycle. They start out life looking and acting one way, then they pupate, and they come out the other end of that looking and doing something entirely different. This is a really brilliant way to go about life, in part because it lets you take advantage of different resources at different times. So as a caterpillar, this monarch butterfly ate leaves. These are heavy and not super calorie dense, but there's a lot of it hanging around, right? They build up their body using this vegetation. They build up a big store of energy. Then they use that energy while they're pupating and reconfiguring their body. Then they emerge, and because they're now eating something that's really light but very calorie dense and more abundant, by the way, because it's later in the season. This is nectar, of course. It can fly around and it can really go places and do stuff, right? This is a brilliant way to go about life. But the problem here is that plants go to great lengths to keep from being eaten. They're using those leaves, right? They need them. So they fill up their tissues with poison to keep from being eaten. The caterpillars got to eat, and the ones that eat the most are the most successful. They're the ones that are reproducing, right? This creates a kind of arms race between insects and plants, where they're constantly trying to develop better poisons and better enzymes that can handle those poisons. Because of this, insects that eat vegetation are typically confined to a small number of host plants with which they have evolved. That's because they can tolerate the poison that that plant makes, and they can't tolerate the poisons that other plants have made. So native insects are often dependent on native plants. They cannot exist without them because as caterpillars, they can only eat the one thing, right? What this means for us is that the foliage of a native plant is a valuable resource for native pollinators. It's not just the flowers that matter here. It's also that native vegetation. So what you can do is you can look up your favorite butterflies and moths and see what the host plants are. You can plant those things. If you're not sure which plants, if you've got a couple of plants that you're trying to weigh the options on, and you're not sure which ones you want to choose, you can see, I think you can do this on the Illinois Pollinators website. I'll have to double check, but you can see how many caterpillars they host, right? And you can just choose the one that's got the most caterpillars, caterpillar species that it's able to host. But so some folks are going to ask, well, can I still plant non-natives? And the answer is yes. Non-native plants, things like you might find in a garden center or at a box store, these can still provide floral resources. They just can't provide food for non-adult pollinators. And they're often not as suitable for things like rain gardens, right? All right, so we've discussed actions that you consider. Let's revisit that question from the beginning of the presentation and see how we do. And again, for those of you viewing the recording, there's not going to be a pop-up, but for folks that are here live, you should be able to see one now. Excellent. Looks like a lot of folks are getting it right. Excellent. All right, I think just about everybody has answered now, so we can close that poll. And again, the answer to that question is B. It's a larval stage. That's when those native plants are most important. All right, so in review, these are our pollinator principles of pollinator gardening. Number one, do no harm. Make sure at the very least you're not causing damage to pollinators. You're not applying pesticide inappropriately. You're reading labels. You're leaving leaves. Number two, right plant in the right place. You're making sure that you're not putting a wetland plant in a dry spot. And you're making sure wherever you're putting these plants that they're not going to get too tall for the environment. Number three, big and small, late and early, you're providing diverse floral resources throughout the entire growing season, and you're doing your best to make sure that there's something out there in the early spring and late fall. And number four, you're trying to plant natives, so your garden is providing floral resources for the adult pollinators and also providing foliage for pollinators when they're younger, when they're caterpillars and they're larvae. And I won't leave you without giving you some resources where you can try to plan out some of your rain gardens and figure out exactly what species you want to use. If you want to see some of those excellent rain garden guides, you can find them in the resources page of the Red Oak Rain Garden website. Rain gardens, again, have the added benefit of helping with local flooding. We also have a new pollinator website, illinoispollinators.org. It has some garden layouts in the pollinator habitat section design page. It also has this excellent pollinator plant selection tool where you can look at some great pollinator-friendly plant species and see if they're going to fit in your garden. And that tool specifically lets you take into consideration many of the things that we've talked about today. You can sort by color, height, blooming period. It's a great tool. I recommend you use it as you're putting your garden together. Next, we would love to know what practices you are likely to put in place within your own home or space. Please take a few minutes to review the pop-up list on your screen and share with us what you might do on your own. Excellent. Very cool. Looks like a lot of folks are likely to do a lot of these things. That's good to see. Very cool. All right, I think we've slowed down here. Go ahead and end that poll. All right, I think that's everything, folks. Eliana, should I give it back over to you?
Yeah, thanks, Brody, and thank you all for attending. If you have questions for Brody, his email is on the screen and in the chat. If you'd like to delve further into information about water conservation, see Illinois American Water's page on wise water use. If you'd like to engage youth in this effort, check out our Youth Water Activity Book, which is a companion to this webinar series. Today's webinar has been recorded. You can see it and other webinars in the series on our YouTube playlist. We've had 3 other great presentations in this series, and I encourage you to check them out. You'll receive an email when this recording posts. We do ask that you take our 1-minute feedback survey to help us improve future programming. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. We also thank our partner, Illinois American Water, and appreciate their commitment to clean water. Have a great rest of your day.